Last week, in the far north of Ontario, the people of a small Ojibwe community called Namaygoosisagagun fled their homes in boats. They pushed out across the water as a wall of smoke and fire rose into the sky behind them, and they did it largely on their own, without help arriving in time. When the flames passed, their community was gone. More than 30 homes, their school, their community centers, reduced to ash. An entire place, generations deep, erased in an afternoon. They are not alone. Namaygoosisagagun is one of two First Nations that have burned to the ground in Ontario this summer, and its people are among more than 1,800 forced from their homes across the province's north in what has become, by early estimates, the worst wildfire season in Ontario's recorded history. This year, the province burned more forest than in any year that has ever been measured. It crossed a line, a real, literal, record-breaking line. And some of what the fire has done this summer genuinely cannot be undone. This is the story of the line Ontario just crossed. What part of it is recoverable, and what part is not, and what comes next. Let me start with exactly what is happening right now, because the scale of it is easy to miss from outside the province. As of late July 2026, Ontario's forests have burned through more than 7,200 square kilometers this season, an area that has already surpassed the previous provincial record. Set back in 2021, and the season is not over. Well over 170 active wildfires are burning across the north. The extraordinary thing is how fast it happened. The vast majority of that burned area went up in just the past 10 days or so. More than 1,800 people have been driven from their homes, and 13 communities have been evacuated. 12 of the 13 are First Nations. Their residents have been scattered across the province, flown or bused to Toronto, Niagara Falls, Sudbury, Thunder Bay, taken in by host communities hundreds of kilometers from home, waiting for word about whether they still have homes to return to. The individual stories give the numbers their weight. Neskantaga First Nation, a remote community that has, staggeringly, lived under a boil water advisory for some 3 decades, the longest in the country, declared a state of emergency and began flying families out as the fire and smoke threatened it. At Namaygoosisagagun, the escape by boat was captured in photographs and video that have since circulated widely. People crowded into small vessels on the water, a towering black wall of smoke and flame filling the sky behind them as they left everything they owned to burn. And at White Sand First Nation, some evacuated residents actually returned in defiance of the evacuation order and began digging fire breaks with heavy machinery and laying sprinkler lines themselves, trying to save what they could, a decision the community's own emergency manager urged against, even as it revealed how alone many of these communities felt in the fight. This is what the crisis looks like on the ground, not an abstraction, but families on boats, and people trying to hand-dig a defense around their own homes because they were not sure anyone else would. How did it happen so suddenly? The ingredients had been building for weeks. Dry, drought-like conditions had settled over northern Ontario, parching the boreal forest until it was ready to burn. Then severe thunderstorms swept across the region, and rather than soaking rain, they delivered lightning, thousands of strikes into that bone-dry forest. A brutal heat wave pushed temperatures to around 15 degrees Celsius above the seasonal normal, and strong winds fanned the new fires into fast-moving walls of flame. Drought, lightning, extreme heat, and wind arriving together, that is the recipe, and in the middle of July, it produced an explosion of fire that overwhelmed the province in a matter of days. Now here is a piece of important context that I want to be honest about, because it cuts against the easy assumption. Nationally, across all of Canada, 2026 is not a record year. In fact, so far it is running at roughly an average pace, around 2.5 million hectares burned countrywide, nowhere near the almost incomprehensible calamity of 2023, when something like 15 to 18 million hectares burned from coast to coast. So this is not a story about the whole country setting a record. It is a story about one province, Ontario, shattering its own record inside what is, for Canada as a whole, a fairly ordinary fire year. And that, in a way, is more unsettling, not less. It means that even in an average national season, The fire can find one region, one forest, and deliver to it the worst year it has ever seen. The catastrophe has become localized and unpredictable. It does not need a national disaster to devastate a province. But the numbers, as stark as they are not the heart of what happened here. The heart of it is who bore the brunt and how they were treated, and this is the part of the story that is generating real anger in Ontario right now. 12 of the 13 evacuated communities are First Nations. These are, overwhelmingly, small, remote, fly-in communities in the northern Boreal, places with few roads, limited resources, and enormous distances between them and the nearest help. And their leaders are saying, plainly and furiously, that when the fire came, they were essentially abandoned. The people of Namaygoosisagagun did not flee by boat because that was the plan. They fled by boat because help did not arrive, and they had no other choice but to self-evacuate as the flames closed in. Across the north, chiefs and indigenous leaders have described communities left to make their own life or death evacuation decisions without adequate support, warning, or resources. Ontario's own Natural Resources Minister acknowledged that the province's crews were, in his words, spread pretty thin across the region. And there is a detail that turns this from tragedy into something that looks more like a failure. First Nations leaders had, before this season, handed the Ontario government a wildfire plan. Dozens of concrete recommendations for how to improve emergency response for exactly these remote northern communities, how to get warnings out faster, how to resource crews properly, how to support First Nations in evacuating. Little was done with it before the record season arrived. Now, with 2 communities burned to the ground and thousands displaced, several First Nations chiefs are demanding an independent public inquiry into the province's emergency response, and some are calling for senior officials to resign. Layered on top of it all is a jurisdictional tangle in which remote First Nations often cannot easily access emergency resources because of the overlapping, unclear responsibilities of provincial and federal governments. The fire was not within anyone's control. The response to it, how fast the warnings went out, whether crews were ready, whether these communities were supported, was, and by many accounts, it failed the people who needed it most. So that is the immediate crisis, a record burn, 2 communities destroyed, thousands displaced, and a bitter reckoning over who was protected and who was left behind. But now I want to turn to the deeper claim in this story, the phrasal line that cannot be undone, because it deserves real precision rather than vague alarm, and the truth is more specific and more interesting than simple doom. Let me be clear about what is not irreversible first, because it matters for honesty. The Boreal forest is a fire forest. It evolved with fire. Many of its trees actually depend on fire to reproduce, and much of what has burned in Ontario this summer will, given time, grow back. A burn scar is not permanent wasteland. If you are picturing the entire northern forest gone forever, that is not the reality, and anyone who tells you otherwise is exaggerating. So when we talk about a line that cannot be undone, we are not talking about this year's blackened acres being lost for all time. Most of them will green again. What genuinely cannot be undone is a different and more specific set of things. 3 of them. The first is the human loss, and it is the most immediate. For the people of Namaygoosisagagun, the community they had is gone in a way that is not simply reversed by rebuilding. A remote, flying community reduced to ash is not restored with a construction crew and a season. It takes years, enormous sums of money, and sustained political will that these communities have historically struggled to command. Some residents will never move back. The specific fabric of a place, the particular homes, the school where the children learned, the web of a community that had existed for generations in that exact spot, can be destroyed in a single afternoon and never fully reassembled. That is the first line that does not uncross. The second thing that cannot be undone lies in the ground itself, and it is something most people have never heard of, even though Ontario holds one of the most important examples on the planet. It is peat. Across Ontario's far north stretches the Hudson Bay Lowlands, one of the largest continuous peatlands on Earth. Peatland is waterlogged ground where dead plant matter never fully decomposes. Instead, it accumulates, layer upon layer, over thousands of years, locking away a staggering quantity of carbon in the saturated soil. This is not a minor feature of the landscape. Peatlands worldwide store nearly a third of all the carbon held in the world's soils, and Canada is home to the single largest peatland carbon store on the planet. It is a vault of ancient carbon built up since the last ice age. And peat can burn, not with dramatic flames, but as a slow, deep, smoldering fire that creeps down into the ground, is extraordinarily difficult to extinguish, and can persist for months. When it burns, it releases carbon that took thousands of years to accumulate, and that carbon does not come back on any timescale that means anything to a human being. Worse, scientists regard peatlands as a potential tipping point in the entire global climate system. Under the pressure of warming and more frequent fire, these grounds can flip from doing what they have done for millennia, quietly absorbing and storing carbon, acting as a sink, to doing the opposite, releasing their carbon into the atmosphere, becoming a source. And once that vault begins to empty, there is no refilling it. Ontario's record fire season is pushing fire further and harder into precisely this kind of terrain. To burn a peatland is to open a door that cannot be closed. And fire is not even the only threat bearing down on these grounds, which sharpens the point. Ontario's far north peatlands sit atop one of the most sought-after mineral deposits in the country, and there are long-running, contested plans to open the region to large-scale mining and the roads to reach it. Developing that landscape would mean draining and disturbing peat that has been intact since the last ice age, and draining a peatland, like burning it, releases its stored carbon and cannot be reversed. So Ontario's peatlands face a double squeeze, fire from above and development from within, both of them pushing on the same irreplaceable ancient carbon store, and both of them one-way doors. Conservationists and many of the indigenous nations whose territories these are have been fighting to keep the peatlands intact precisely because, once disturbed, they do not come back. The third thing that cannot be undone is the most consequential of all, and it is about whether the forest can even remain a forest. This is the part that the phrase "a line that cannot be undone" is really pointing at, so it is worth understanding carefully. The boreal's ability to regrow after fire depends entirely on fire not coming back too soon. Historically, any given patch of this forest in northern North America burned roughly once every 70 to 130 years. That long gap is essential. It gives the trees, especially the black spruce that dominates the boreal, enough time to mature, to build up a store of seeds, and to rebuild the carbon in the soil before the next fire arrives. The forest is built to recover, but recovery takes time, and the whole system is calibrated to that generous interval between burns. It is worth understanding just how elegantly and how precariously this works. Black spruce is a fire species. It holds its seeds in resinous cones high in the canopy, sealed shut, and it relies on the heat of a fire to melt them open and release a shower of seed onto the freshly burned, nutrient-rich ground. A brilliant strategy that lets the forest reseed itself in the very disturbance that destroyed it. But there is a catch built into that strategy. A black spruce needs to be old enough to have grown a canopy full of seed-bearing cones before it can pull this off. A young tree, only a decade or two old, has few cones and little seed. So if a fire sweeps through a stand that burned just 15 or 20 years earlier, the trees that grew back are still too young to have restocked their seed supply, and when the flames melt open the cones, there is almost nothing inside to release. The forest's self-reseeding trick misfires. The ground is left bare of spruce seed, and whatever colonizes it next, grasses, shrubs, fast-spreading deciduous trees like aspen and birch, takes over instead. The evergreen boreal quietly converts into something else, something that stores less carbon and may hold that new state for a very long time. Climate change is collapsing that interval. As the north warms and dries and the fires grow more frequent, forests that once burned every century are now, in places, reburning within 30 years, or burning twice, even 3 times, in the span that used to contain a single fire. And when a forest burns again before it has recovered, something can break. A major scientific study, published in 2025, examined this directly in boreal forests and found that increasing fire frequency and reburning significantly reduced the forest's ability to store carbon and lead to outright regeneration failure. The young trees have not yet made seeds when the second fire comes, so there is nothing to reseed the land. The legacy carbon, the carbon that had survived previous fires, accumulated in the soil over centuries, is combusted and lost, and the dense, evergreen forest does not return as itself. It converts into something else, sparse deciduous stands, shrubland, or open ground that holds far less carbon and may never again be the forest it was. That is the true line that cannot be undone. Not this year's fire scar, most of which will recover, but the threshold at which fire comes so frequently that the forest loses the ability to regenerate at all and shifts permanently into a different, diminished, lower carbon state. Cross that threshold across a large enough area, and there is no bringing the old forest back. And every record-breaking, fast-arriving, unusually intense season, like the one Ontario is living through right now, is a push toward that threshold. So what comes next? The most honest forecast is more of this. The trend across Ontario's Boreal is unmistakable, and it points in one direction: fires that are more frequent, larger, and more intense, driven by a warming climate, deepening droughts, hotter heat waves, and more lightning. This year's record will not stand for long. The central ecological question of the coming decades becomes the regeneration question, whether Ontario's Boreal recovers between fires or begins converting to something else, and the peatlands of the far north become a massive wildcard that could either keep holding their ancient carbon or start releasing it into an already warming atmosphere, accelerating everything. And then there is the human reckoning, which is happening in real time. The demand for a public inquiry, the pressure to finally take that ignored wildfire plan seriously, to actually resource and empower remote First Nations to prepare, to warn, to evacuate, and to defend themselves, rather than leaving them to flee by boat. Hard questions about whether some of the most exposed and least defensible communities can keep being rebuilt in place, or whether, as in flood country, the conversation eventually turns to relocation. And underlying all of it, the same brutal truth that runs through every wildfire story in the warming north across a remote landscape this vast. Actually extinguishing these fires is largely impossible. The future of fire management is not putting the fires out. It is prediction, prevention, preparation, and protecting the people in the path. And Ontario has just demonstrated, painfully, how far it still has to go on that last part. There is also a loop tightening in the background that makes the whole trajectory harder to escape. Every severe season in Ontario's Boreal and every hectare of peat that smolders adds carbon to the atmosphere, and that carbon drives more of the warming that dries the forest and shortens the interval between fires, which produces more severe seasons, which release more carbon. Ontario's north is not just a victim of climate change in this story. It has become, in its worst years, a contributor to it. A forest and a peatland that are supposed to be storing carbon, but that can, when they burn, hand it back to the sky. That is the feedback that turns a bad decade into a self-reinforcing spiral, and it is why the fate of these northern landscapes matters far beyond the province. The adaptation choices ahead are correspondingly hard and unavoidable. How much to spend hardening remote communities with fire breaks and better warning systems, whether to keep rebuilding the most exposed places in the same spots or, eventually, to help them move, how to protect the peatlands from both fire and development, and how to share the real decision-making power and the resources with the First Nations who live closest to the flames and have been asking, so far largely in vain, to be genuinely equipped to face them. Let me end with balance, because this deserves clarity rather than despair. Ontario's forests are not doomed. The Boreal is resilient, and much of what burned this year will return. Not every community was lost, and the ones that were can, with real commitment, be helped to recover. Canada has some of the most skilled wildfire crews in the world, and the public attention in the coming inquiry could force genuine improvements in how remote communities are protected. A single record season, as devastating as it is not the end of the story. But the line in the title is real, and it is worth naming precisely one last time. Ontario did just cross a line. It burned more forest than in any year ever recorded, and it did so inside an ordinary national season, which tells you how quickly this can happen anywhere. Much of that, the trees, the green, will come back, but the community of Namaygoosisagagun as it was will not. The ancient carbon rising from any peat that burns will not return in 100 human lifetimes, and if the fires keep coming this fast, the forest's very ability to stay a forest may not survive either. The difference between a wound that heals and a line that cannot be undone is, in the end time, the years the forest is given to recover between fires, and that interval is the one thing the warming climate is steadily taking away. What comes next depends, more than anything, on whether we give it back.